Welcome to this explainer. Today we're jumping right into a super emotionally charged moment from the ancient epic, the Mahabharata. We're going to unpack a fascinating scene that highlights a timeless philosophical conflict. Honestly, it's one you've probably faced yourself at some point. What on earth do you do when doing the right thing puts you at a massive disadvantage?
It's a heavy question, right? What happens when playing by the rules costs you absolutely everything? We're going to explore this exact dilemma by looking at the exiled Pandava brothers. They have been pushed to the absolute brink and are currently facing the ultimate test of their morals, their patience, and frankly, their sanity.
So, let's set the stage. The Pandava brothers, they're currently living a completely miserable, distressful existence, exiled deep in the Kamyaka woods. They didn't just lose a war. Oh no, they were stripped of their entire kingdom by deceitful gamblers in this totally rigged game of dice. And to make matters worse, they are deeply grieving the absence of their greatest warrior, Arjuna, who had to leave to obtain weapons from the celestial regions. Morale is, to put it mildly, at rock bottom. Section 1. The Clash of Ideologies. Pragmatism versus Absolute Virtue. Let's dive right into this intense debate between two brothers who handle this traumatic exile completely differently.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core conflict we're dealing with. You've got Bhima standing tall as the pragmatic warrior. He is demanding action, advocating for fighting deceit with deceit, based on his Kshatriya duty. But then, in stark contrast, you have Yudhishthira, the righteous king. His approach, the complete opposite. He's all about patience, unwavering virtue, absolute truth, and strictly adhering to their vows.
Let's look at how Bhima builds his case here. He forcefully argues that as part of the warrior class, a Kshatriya, their fundamental, absolutely crucial duty is to rule their kingdom. It is categorically not to hide out in the woods while their deceitful enemies, the sons of Dhritarashtra, are out there growing stronger and collecting tributes. He literally tells his brother point blank, to rule is your foremost duty.
Now, what's really fascinating here is Bhima's core justification for striking back immediately. He firmly believes that because their enemies cheated them at the dice game, using deceit to destroy those enemies is perfectly acceptable. It's that classic fight fire with fire argument. To him, slaying the deceitful by deceit, it isn't a sin. It's just leveling the playing field.
But of course, there's a catch. The brothers made a sacred pledge to live 13 years in exile. So how on earth does Bhima get around that? Well, he points to this absolutely fascinating Vedic loophole. He argues that according to sacred texts, one day and night spent in the observance of extremely difficult vows is morally equivalent to a full year. Do the math. By his logic, if they just do a single day of intense vows, boom, the 13 years are up, meaning they can legally and righteously attack their enemy Duryodhana immediately.
And he backs this up with a very practical, frankly chilling warning. He argues that if they just sit around waiting for the clock to run out, enemy spies are eventually gonna trace them in the woods. And once found, their enemies will simply force them into another rigged game of dice, completely restarting this vicious cycle of exile and a lifetime of wretchedness. He's effectively saying, look, action is literally our only mechanism for survival here.
Section 2. The Burden of Virtue. Yudhishthira's Refusal. So the crucial point now is how the righteous king actually responds to this incredibly logical, super passionate plea for action. Well, despite the solid logic, that very clever Vedic loophole, and the acute pain of their current situation, Yudhishthira completely rejects Bhima's plan. He tries to pacify his brother, sure, but his moral stance, immovable. He flat out refuses to tell an untruth or use fraud, even to defeat a wicked and irrepressible enemy. For Yudhishthira, virtue is absolute. There are simply no loopholes when it comes to the truth. Just as this massive ideological stalemate happens between the brothers, a revered ascetic named Sage Vrihadaswa arrives at the forest. Yudhishthira, being ever the righteous and duty-bound king, immediately worships him with the traditional offering of madhuparka. And the arrival of this holy man kind of creates this safe space, prompting Yudhishthira to just pour out his heart in a rare, really profound moment of vulnerability.
Section 3. A matter of perspective. The woe is me pivot. Let's see how this builds into an emotional confession that completely changes the trajectory of our story. So Yudhishthira starts recounting the agonizing sequence of his trauma to the sage, and the accumulation of it all is, well, it's pretty staggering. First, because he's not adept at dice, he was entirely deprived of his wealth and kingdom by cunning gamblers. Second, his wife, who was dearer to him than life itself, was humiliatingly dragged right into a public assembly. Third, he was sent into this distressful exile dressed in nothing but rough deerskins.
And finally, he's surviving all this while deprived of the company of their greatest asset, Arjuna.
But you have to realize, the trauma isn't just physical, it is deeply, deeply psychological. He actually admits to the sage that the memory of the harsh, cruel speeches from his enemies during that infamous gambling match tortures him relentlessly. He is so consumed by these memories that he passes whole nights in sleepless agony and anxiety. It's really heartbreaking.
Wallowing in this immense suffering, Yudhishthira makes a sweeping, definitive declaration. He looks at the sage and asks, "Is there a king on this earth who is more unfortunate than myself?" And before the sage can even get a word in, Yudhishthira concludes, "To my thinking, there is no man more wretched than I am." He firmly, absolutely believes he has hit the lowest possible point of human existence.
Which brings us to an absolute mic drop moment in the text. The sage listens to all this despair and calmly replies by promising to tell the history of a king who actually had it much, much worse. I mean, imagine thinking you are the most miserable person in the history of the world, and someone looks at you and essentially says, "Actually, take a seat. Let me tell you a real tragedy."
The sage introduces King Nala, the celebrated son of Virasena. Now, Nala was a highly virtuous man, really well versed in the knowledge of virtue and wealth. But just like Yudhishthira, he was deceitfully defeated by a man named Pushkara. Afflicted with calamity, Nala was forced to abandon his life and dwell in the woods with his spouse. The parallels here are intentionally striking.
But then, the sage completely flips the script by pointing out a massive, glaring difference between their two situations. Look at Yudhishthira's camp. His exile is brutal, yes, for sure, but he is surrounded by heroic brothers who are like celestials, and he's accompanied by wise sages and brahmanas. He has a whole support system. Now consider Nala. He faced his tragic exile utterly and completely alone. He had no slaves, no chariots, no brothers, and no friends by his side.
Hearing this, Yudhishthira is instantly captivated. Suddenly realizing his relative fortune, he begs the sage to relate the detailed history of the illustrious King Nala. This revelation acts as a total shock to his system, pulling him right out of his self-pity and beautifully setting the stage for an epic tale nestled right within our main story.
We've seen the heavy burden of absolute virtue on Yudhishthira, and how the loss of a kingdom can feel like the literal end of the world. But now we're left to wonder, right alongside the righteous king, if losing your wealth, your status, and being exiled to the woods isn't the absolute bottom, just how much worse could it possibly get for King Nala? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.